For decades, the story most people learned was simple. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in Indonesia called Toba erupted with roughly 10,000 times the force of Mount St. Helens, choked the sky with ash, and nearly wiped humanity off the planet. It is a great story. It has been repeated in documentaries, textbooks, and articles for 30 years. It is also, according to the researchers who have spent the last decade checking it, almost certainly wrong. The real event that pushed humanity to the edge of extinction happened over 800,000 years earlier than Toba, left no ash layer, no eruption, no single dramatic moment at all. It nearly ended us anyway, and it did it slowly enough that nobody watching it happen would have had any single day to point to and call the beginning of the end. The Toba catastrophe idea made sense on paper. A super eruption that size did happen, producing somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of magma, one of the largest eruptions of the last 2 million years by any measure. It occurred around the same time genetic studies once placed a mysterious drop in human diversity, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. For years, that overlap looked like a smoking gun, and it is easy to see why the theory caught on the way it did. A volcano that size, a population crash roughly the same age, and a story that writes itself. The idea was formalized in the late 1990s and held its place as the leading explanation for decades, showing up in documentaries and textbooks as settled fact long before anyone had the tools to test it seriously. It has not held up. Genomic studies looking specifically for a sharp, global collapse in diversity around 74,000 years ago have not found one. Archaeological sites sit right on top of Toba's ash layer in multiple regions, including northern India and the Arabian Peninsula, meaning people were living there before the eruption and kept making the same stone tools afterward, without the kind of gap you would expect from a population that had just been gutted. Newer climate models also walk back the original doomsday picture, showing far less severe and far shorter cooling than the earliest estimates assumed. Toba was real, and it was violent. What it was not, based on the current evidence, is the thing that nearly ended us. So if not Toba, what was it? In 2023, a team of geneticists led by Yi-Xuan Pan published a paper in the journal Science that reconstructed human population history using a new statistical tool called FitCoal, short for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process, built to detect population signals further back in time and with more precision than older tools could manage. A bottleneck, in the genetic sense, is what happens when a population shrinks so sharply that most of its genetic variation disappears, along with the individuals who carried it. The survivors rebuild the species from a much narrower pool of DNA than existed before, and that narrowing leaves a permanent, readable mark in the genes of everyone descended from them, no matter how large the population eventually grows back to. The method works by tracing genetic lineages backward through time. Every person's DNA carries fragments inherited from ancestors going back tens of thousands of generations, and those fragments can be traced until separate lineages merge into shared ancestors. When a population is large, that merging happens slowly, since there are many possible ancestors to trace back to. When a population is small, the merging speeds up dramatically because there are only so many ancestors left to converge on. The team applied this method to genomic sequences from 3,154 present-day people, drawn from 10 African populations and 40 non-African ones. What came out the other end was a population crash unlike anything else on record for our lineage. Between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the effective size of the human ancestral population fell from an estimated 100,000 individuals to around 1,280. Effective population size is not simply a head count of every person alive at the time. It measures how many individuals were actually contributing offspring to future generations, which is usually a smaller and more meaningful number than the raw population figure, since it strips out anyone who never reproduced. That is a drop of about 98.7%. And the population did not bounce back quickly. It stayed critically low for approximately 117,000 years. To put a number like 1,280 breeding individuals in perspective, that is smaller than the current population of mountain gorillas, a species conservationists already classify as critically endangered. For over 100,000 years, the entire lineage that would eventually become every human being alive today existed at numbers that would earn a modern species emergency protection status. This finding does not stand alone. Paleoanthropologists studying the physical fossil record had already noticed something strange about this exact window of time, long before fit coal existed to explain it. There is a real, well-documented gap in African and Eurasian human fossils dating between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago. Specimens from just before and just after the window are reasonably common. Specimens from inside it are rare. Giorgio Manzi, an anthropologist at Sapienza University of Rome who worked on the 2023 study, has pointed out that this gap lines up almost exactly with the genetic bottleneck window. Chronologically speaking, fewer people alive at any given time simply means fewer bodies left behind to fossilize in the first place. The timing of all this was not a coincidence. Roughly 900,000 years ago, Earth's climate system was in the middle of one of the most significant reorganizations in its recent history, a shift scientists call the mid-Pleistocene transition. Before this point, ice ages had followed a relatively mild 41,000-year cycle. After it, the planet locked into a harsher rhythm of ice ages lasting up to 100,000 years each, with thicker ice sheets and longer, colder extremes than the cycles that came before. The worst stretch of this transition hit around 875,000 years ago, a period geologists label marine isotope stage 22. Sediment cores from around the world capture it clearly. Global ice volumes surged, temperatures dropped hard, and the climate systems that had supported life for millions of years began failing in multiple places at once. In Africa, where this population was living, forests retreated and deserts expanded. Rainfall patterns that had held steady for millions of years collapsed. Lakes dried up. Rivers stopped running. The Sahara, already a significant barrier, grew wider on both edges, swallowing grassland that had supported the plants and animals this population depended on. Average global temperatures during the peak of this period are estimated to have run 6 to 8 degrees Celsius colder than today, and that average hides far worse extremes at the continental interiors, where winter temperatures may have dropped 15 to 20 degrees below anything modern humans have ever had to adapt to without technology. A species that had spent its whole evolutionary history in the warm tropics was now facing conditions that did not give anyone alive at the time a season or two to adjust before things got worse. None of this happened in isolation from the animals this population depended on for food. Grassland retreat and prolonged drought put pressure on the herds that early humans scavenged and hunted, meaning the food supply was shrinking at the same time the climate itself was turning hostile. A population already struggling to find enough calories was now competing for a smaller pool of prey animals against every other predator on the same landscape, at the exact moment its own numbers were collapsing. Here is the detail that makes the scale of this crisis land. The population that endured this collapse almost certainly could not make fire on demand. The earliest solid evidence for that specific ability, deliberately building and maintaining a hearth at will, comes from a site in Israel called Gesher Benot Yaakov, where archaeologists have found burned seeds, wood, and flint, arranged in patterns consistent with repeated, deliberate hearth building. That evidence dates to around 790,000 years ago, which places it near the tail end of this bottleneck, not the start of it. That does not mean fire was completely absent from their lives. Research at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa has found burnt animal bone deep inside the cave, far beyond where a wildfire could have reached on its own, in deposits dating back over 1 million years, well before this bottleneck even began. The most likely explanation is that these early humans were capturing fire from natural sources, wildfires sparked by lightning, and carrying embers back to camp rather than creating flame from nothing. That is a meaningful difference. A population that can tend a fire it did not start can still lose it. To rain, to a bad night, to simply running out of fuel at the wrong moment, with no way to relight it until the next lightning strike happened to cooperate. For most of the roughly 117,000 years this population spent near extinction, fire was at best an unreliable visitor, rather than a tool they fully controlled. Clothing was not an option either, at least not in any form that would have actually helped. The technology to produce fitted, sewn garments would not exist for hundreds of thousands of years. Bone needles, the tool that finally makes tailored clothing possible, do not show up in the archaeological record until around 45,000 years ago. Whatever this population wrapped around themselves against the cold was almost certainly untailored hide, providing minimal insulation against conditions that regularly dropped below freezing. Their tools were not much better suited to the moment. This was a population working with Oldowan choppers and early Acheulean hand axes, essentially sharpened stones operated by hand, at close range, with nothing resembling a spear point, a spear thrower, or a bow. Hunting meant getting dangerously close to an animal, or more often, losing that competition to something faster and better armed by evolution, and settling for whatever scraps of a carcass hyenas and larger predators left behind. Fossilized feces recovered from this period show cut marks on bone fragments mixed in with the remains, direct evidence of scavenging rather than confident, successful hunting. Plant foods filled in the gaps when meat was not available, though the Ice Age climate made tubers, nuts, and fruit scarce and heavily seasonal, never a reliable fallback on its own. The predators sharing this landscape were not modest either. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and lions larger than anything alive today were all competing for the same shrinking pool of prey this population was also chasing, and this group had nothing sharper than a handheld stone to argue with a predator that outweighed them by several hundred pounds. Reaching adulthood here was not a given. It was closer to a coin flip. Small bands, likely somewhere around 20 to 30 people each, scattered across enormous distances, made finding unrelated mates difficult, which means inbreeding was probably a constant background pressure on top of everything else. It is a fairly brutal answer to a fairly obvious question. How does a group this small survive predators this dangerous, in a climate this hostile, with tools this basic, for over 100,000 years? Mostly, it seems, by getting lucky, over and over again, for a long time. The strongest proof this actually happened is not in any fossil. It is sitting in the DNA of every person reading this sentence. Human genetic diversity is unusually low for a species our size, low enough that it has puzzled geneticists for years. Chimpanzees, with a global population in the low hundreds of thousands, carry more genetic variation than the 8 billion humans alive today. That paradox only makes sense if something forced our ancestors through an extreme demographic squeeze at some point, and the 2023 study gives that squeeze a name, a date, and a head count. This legacy is not evenly distributed even today. Human genetic diversity remains highest in Africa, where the bottleneck signal was detected most directly, and progressively lower in populations descended from later migrations outward, a pattern consistent with a small founding group whose descendants carried only a fraction of the original variation with them wherever they went next. One specific genetic fingerprint ties directly back to this period. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Every other great ape has 24. The difference comes down to human chromosome 2, which is actually two separate ancestral chromosomes fused into one. The fusion point is still visible under the right analysis, marked by leftover genetic sequences that normally only appear at the very ends of chromosomes, sitting instead in the middle where the two original pieces joined. This fusion is one of the most frequently cited pieces of physical evidence for our shared ancestry with other great apes, since it is exactly the kind of one-time event evolutionary biology predicts should happen occasionally and then get carried forward by every descendant. Researchers estimate this fusion occurred somewhere between 900,000 and 740,000 years ago, sitting almost exactly inside the bottleneck window. In a population of 100,000, a random chromosomal fusion in one individual would likely fade out over generations, diluted by everyone else's DNA. In a population of 1,280, a change like that has a real chance of spreading through the entire group and becoming permanent. Every human being alive today carries that fused chromosome. It is, in a literal sense, a signature left behind by the bottleneck itself, and there is a decent chance you have never once thought about the fact that you are carrying it around. Despite everything working against them, this population did not stay put. Human sites begin appearing suddenly across Eurasia, starting around 900,000 years ago, right as the crisis was unfolding. not before it and not long after. Fossils at Atapuerca in Spain, assigned to Homo antecessor, date to roughly 800,000 years ago, representing one of the earliest known human populations in Western Europe. Footprints preserved in ancient mudflats at Happisburgh in England show people had reached the far northwest corner of Europe by around 900,000 years ago, surviving at latitudes with 16 hours of winter darkness and regular freezing temperatures, without fire and without tailored clothing. Human presence during this same window has also been documented in China and Java, though the fossil evidence from those sites remains thinner and harder to date precisely. Rather than waiting out the crisis in one safe location, this group gambled on movement, spreading into some of the least hospitable places on the planet at the exact moment it was already closest to disappearing. The recovery, when it finally came, was fast. Around 813,000 years ago, this critically small population began expanding again, and within a relatively short span, the numbers had climbed roughly 20-fold, from an estimated 1,280 breeding individuals up to somewhere around 30,000. Climate conditions did ease somewhat around this time, but climate alone does not fully explain a rebound that's sharp. The more likely driver is the same technology that had been missing for the entire crisis: fire, finally mastered and maintained on purpose, as shown by the hearths at Gesher Benot Yaakov. The difference between tending a fire you got lucky enough to catch from a lightning strike and being able to build one whenever you need it is the difference between a resource and a tool. A tool can be planned around. A resource just has to be waited for. Fire changes essentially everything about what a small, struggling population can do. Cooking makes food dramatically more caloric and kills off many of the parasites and bacteria that come with eating meat raw. Warmth extends the range of livable territory into regions that would otherwise be off-limits, meaning descendants of this population could push into colder latitudes their ancestors could never have survived a winter in. Light pushes back the hours predators get to hunt uncontested, which is a fairly significant upgrade after 100,000 years of hoping the dark stayed empty. And beyond the purely physical benefits, some researchers argue the extended time humans could now safely spend together around a fire after dark helped drive the development of more complex social behavior and language, since it created hours of shared, low-risk time that simply did not exist before. The timing of all this lines up with something else notable in the fossil and genetic record. The estimated split between the ancestors of modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans falls somewhere around 765,000 to 550,000 years ago, not long after this bottleneck ends. Some researchers have proposed that the intense selective pressure of nearly 100,000 years spent at the edge of extinction may have shaped which traits carried forward into that split, though this remains speculative rather than settled. Scientists like Antonio Rosas of Spain's National Museum of Natural Sciences have specifically cautioned against reading too much evolutionary significance into the bottleneck without more direct fossil evidence to back it up. This deserves a direct account of where the real disagreement sits, rather than presenting all of this as a closed case. Even scientists who were not involved in the original study flagged early on how much weight this finding was being asked to carry. University of Wisconsin-Madison population geneticist Aaron Ragsdale, reviewing the work from outside the research team, noted that it raises real questions about a stretch of time where both genetic and fossil evidence are otherwise thin on the ground, and said he was eager to see the result replicated using other methods. That caution turned out to be warranted. The 2023 study's own authors note that the bottleneck signal appeared strongly and consistently across all 10 African populations they examined, but only showed up indirectly in non-African populations, a distinction the original researchers attribute to later population movements partially obscuring the older signal. A follow-up paper published in 2024 in the journal Genetics went further and argued the entire bottleneck signal could be a statistical artifact, a pattern produced by unmodeled complexity in ancient population structure rather than proof of an actual demographic collapse. Population structure, in this context, refers to the fact that ancient humans were not one uniform, evenly mixing group. They lived in separate, partially isolated populations that occasionally interbred, and critics argue that kind of hidden structure can sometimes mimic the genetic signature of a bottleneck, even when no true population crash occurred. That critique is not a fringe objection. Researchers attempting to replicate the original bottleneck signal using other statistical methods have so far failed to reproduce it. The picture has kept shifting since. A 2025 reanalysis using different methods reached a different conclusion about how consistent the signal is between African and non-African populations than the original paper did. Then a more recent study, revisiting the original data directly, found that the timing and severity of the bottleneck were in fact nearly identical between African and non-African populations after all, which complicates the 2024 artifact critique without fully resolving it either. That is a peer-reviewed critique, answered by more peer-reviewed research. Still ongoing, and as of now, the disagreement has not been fully settled in either direction. What can be said with real confidence is that human genetic diversity today is unusually low for our population size, and that something in our deep past caused that. Exactly how severe and exactly when is still being argued over in real time by the people who study it for a living. No single dramatic eruption did this to us. No sky full of ash, no headline moment anyone could point to and say, that was the day it almost ended. Just a climate that quietly stopped cooperating, for a long time, pressing down on a population too small and too poorly equipped to have any real margin for error. If Toba had actually been the culprit, it would at least have had the decency to be over quickly. What actually happened to us took over 100,000 years, with no fire and no warning, and it nearly worked. However, it did not. Whatever combination of fire, luck, and sheer stubbornness got that population from 1,1280 back up to 30,000, it worked well enough that the chromosome fused somewhere in the middle of that crisis is sitting in your cells right now, whether you ever gave it a second thought or not. Every disagreement modern researchers still have about the exact numbers changes nothing about that basic fact. We are here because a group smaller than a single high school graduating class refused to be the last.